right, good afternoon, everyone. In the interest of using your time wisely, we're going to proceed with this panel. My name is Jeff Quyle with Radius Indiana. I appreciate the privilege of working with the IEDA on this panel, and I want to thank the board for putting this together. It is a topic that's very timely. I know down in my region of the state, we're hearing questions about how do you handle the needs of these really large projects that are floating around, finding a home in Indiana. We want them in Indiana, of course, but we understand there are ways you have to work to make it fit your community. So we've got three panel members who bring a diverse set of standards and opinions and experiences with working with large data center kind of projects. So we're going to start out. Devin, I've asked everyone to introduce themselves, so we'll just go across, let the gentlemen introduce themselves, and then we will proceed with our discussion. We would welcome questions from the audience during the course of the conversation. So if something we mentioned really pops a good question for you, raise your hand. We'll try to find you and let you speak up, ask your question. So thank you, everyone.
First of all, I'd like to put the lawyer all over there. Yeah, to Jeff's point, folks, don't let us ramble up here for an hour or two, right? Like, raise your hand, ask questions. We're here to provide insight and advice to you, right? And you all are seeing things that we're not seeing and vice versa, so let's make this a very collaborative discussion. My name is Devin Hillsdon-Smith. I was an economic developer for a decade in the state of Indiana, did 5 years at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, and approximately 5 years down at the River Ridge Commerce Center across the Ohio River from Louisville, Kentucky. About 2 years ago, I ended up moving over to the dark side, and now I am a national industrial site selector with Cushman and Wakefield, with a very specialized team in the build-to-suit vertical at the firm, primarily focused on manufacturing-intensive industrial projects, so luxury automotive car makers, traditional manufacturing, and part of the reason why I'm up here, and I hope that none of my clients ever hear that I did this presentation, but I have data center clients as well, so looking forward to getting into it.
Thanks, my name is Jonathan Leist. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Fort Wayne. I've been with the City of Fort Wayne for 4 years. Prior to that, I worked for the town of Culver and Huntington County here in Indiana. So about 20 years of municipal experience, and excited to be with you all today to talk about these large-scale projects.
Thanks. My name's Rick Hall. I'm with Barnes & Thornburg. I've been with Barnes & Thornburg my whole career. Started out as primarily a bond lawyer, and then flowed into the economic development incentive world, which I really enjoy for all the reasons I'm sure you do too, and the impact you can bring to your communities. So, with respect to today's topic, I represent big data center. I have represented communities, recruiting data centers. Same thing with large manufacturers. Represent like Kokomo, for example, in their battery plant deals, and then have represented other large manufacturers in their deals. And then also, a big part of my practice is an energy-related topic, but maybe not in the same way these other two are, as I represent, 15 counties on solar and wind projects around the state, which I know you guys are being hit with a lot, and it could be a hot, controversial topic. So happy to be here and have this conversation.
Jonathan, I'm going to start out asking you to describe a significant project that you've dealt with recently in the Fort Wayne area, and talk a little bit about what the conversation was that you had with your local community leaders. What was the why that they wanted you to answer about why this was a good project for the community?
Yeah, excuse me, if we go back about not quite even a year, I think Rick and I were at the same meeting at City Hall in Fort Wayne, trying to get approval for a taxpayer agreement and a tax phase-in for a Google data center in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And we had been working on that project probably a little over a year. And to go back and forth, working with the developer, it actually moved pretty quickly for a project that size. We didn't have Part of it was land acquisition, getting land under control. We had about 300 acres when we started conversations, and the project kind of evolved. And Google, at the time we didn't know it was Google, but it ended up being Google, was really looking for a little bit larger site, so we kind of went through that land acquisition process. By the time we get to the table, looking for approvals at City Council, we've given a lot of thought to how we're presenting this in the community and what we want to see in the community. And I would say the biggest thing for us, I think everybody in the room knows pretty well the data center exemption that exists on personal property, but kind of sticking to your guns maybe a little bit as a community and realizing that on the real property side, there's still a tremendous opportunity for communities on these projects. One of the talking points I think we came up with as we're looking for these approvals is in the agreement that we ended up presenting to our city council again about a year ago, we could say that this project would make this site one of the top 15 taxpayers in the city of Fort Wayne within about a year. And I mean, that's a huge thing to be able to say to your community. I mean, a lot of other things that went into it, like with all these data center projects, utilities obviously a huge part of the conversation there. The city of Fort Wayne, we own our water and sewer utilities, so we had to be able to speak to what that agreement was going to look like and be able to accurately represent that it's a fair deal for our utility customers as well, most of whom are city residents. So I'd say those were probably the two biggest points for us. Just like any other project, you have to really be able to sell the dollars and cents of it too. It has to still make sense. There are a lot of, I think, kind of side benefits for some of our, I'm going to say, a smaller community, even though we're the second largest in the state of Indiana. We're not used to working with Fortune 15 tech companies, so there's a little bit of excitement that comes with that. There's some unique offerings that a Google or Microsoft or Apple or any of those larger tech companies can bring to your community. So those things are great, but really, I think the first thing we really led with in the conversation was, the impact of the investment and the impact on tax revenue for us. This investment, and Fort Wayne happened to be in an area kind of at the edge of town, but in our southeast quadrant, which was a historically underinvested community, the most diverse section of our cities in southeast Fort Wayne. And so being able to attract these jobs in the way that fit in with our existing economic development plans is really key. And that was another huge selling point for us.
If you don't mind me going, like quarterback of the, what were the investment numbers and job creation numbers as well?
Yeah, when we made the announcement in December, job numbers were not huge. I believe they only committed to 20 new full-time jobs. So that really wasn't the selling point. $800 million in investment. And so that was, about a year ago in December. When we were having those discussions, we realized there was also an opportunity for that to grow over time, that would probably not be the minimum or the actual investment over time. We were hoping for more than that. And then by the time we had a sort of a groundbreaking, it was a little bit past groundbreaking, but an event with the governor's office in March, the announcement moved up to $2 billion in investment and 200 new jobs.
Maybe to give the other side of the table's perspective on working with Fort Wayne, I represented Google in that deal and worked with Jonathan and others in the city. And they were outstanding to work with. And when I think about, why was that? I think that they were able to speak with a single, clear voice. Now, that doesn't mean we have unanimous consensus of all our council members, our mayor, et cetera. But we know where people stand and what the issues are, so that I felt like there was a great dialogue of open communication where the city shared what its needs were, which allowed Google to react and try to satisfy those. And it was truly, once I think the decision within the city generally was made that this is something we want to do in our community, then there was this collective group that worked to get it across the finish line, and the city was really, really helpful in communicating what the issues are, being responsive to our needs. Doesn't mean anybody was rolling over on it either side, but there was a great relationship to get to the finish line. And I think it was bolstered by the fact that they had council members that were very engaged in the process, including going to visit some of our facilities in Ohio that brought that information back and really, I think, allowed the deal to get approved because they were so engaged and willing to do their own research on it.
Yeah, just kind of piggyback on that a little bit. Just in terms of the timing, land use approvals came before the city council meeting I was talking about where the taxpayer agreement was approved. So residents had had a chance at public hearings to speak out about, mostly about land use and zoning. But for a project of this size, and sadly for only a year, sometimes my memory gets fuzzy, but I don't think we had gone public at the land use hearings. Yeah, it wasn't public yet who the actual operator was going to be. So we did have a lot of residents come out, mostly neighbors concerned about what was going to happen there. But as you said, Rick, by the time then we got to the council table in December, we had several of us go multiple times to check out the facilities. And I mean, it's like any other project you all work on every day. I mean, being there, boots on the ground, being able to come back and tell, our council representative from that district went, several staff went, and we felt like we could just really answer questions and speak a lot more intelligently to any concerns the neighbors had about the project by having seen one in person.
Devin, do you want to speak about how communities you've dealt with? Devin, you talk a little bit about some of the communities you've dealt with, how they measure what the value is to their community?
Yeah, so for context, when I say I have data center clients, I'm on kind of both sides of the spectrum there, right? So I do have a hyperscaler end user client, right? So I've seen how that operates, but I also have the dreaded B word, right? I've got the developer clients as well. And the conversation that we have to have when we go into communities is very different depending on which client we're talking about. Communities, first of all, the way that I approach it, so let me just go from the developer side, right? And something, first of all, let me just ask the room. If you have worked a data center project, raise your hand. So if you're not raising your hand, you're lying to me, right? Like, that, this is just, everybody's getting hit up at these, right? I think one thing to preface and to think through is there's kind of three tranches of inquiries that you're gonna get. You're going to get the big end user hyperscaler, right, who you're probably going to be negotiating with. You're going to have no idea who they are until you get far enough along. But that's the kind of like the sweet spot, right? You know that you've got the end user, right? There's no speculating. Like that's kind of the gem. Then you've got on the far other end of the spectrum, you've got these tire kicker, speculative, maybe a little unscrupulous developers that, quite frankly, the only value that they're bringing is that they're coming in and buying up, 200-300 acres of your land for $10,000 an acre, and they're just hoping to find a way to do a little bit of work and be able to flip it for $120,000 an acre and make 12x, right? Not much value to your community. The next tranche, which is the developers that I work in, kind of in the middle, are those that are sophisticated enough and have the connections in with the hyperscalers and know what they're doing. And I always think of these groups, and this is how I have conversations with the communities, is if you're a community looking to find a way to attract data center investment, but you either don't know how, you don't have the wherewithal, you haven't done the land assemblage, you don't maybe have the capital or the risk tolerance to really get into what you need to do to attract them, there is an opportunity to almost think of this middle tranche of developers as like a private partner, right? Where you can leverage private sector capital and private sector risk sink to help move things forward. So depending on the tranche that we're talking about, I think the conversation looks a little different. I would say the best communities around the country that I've dealt with are those that are not just in sales mode with me from the beginning. They are asking very intentional and sophisticated questions of me right from the get-go. So when we're talking about developers, I've had communities straight up say to me, what value are they going to bring? Right? Why should we even work with you? And it's not just about, the jobs numbers and the investment numbers, but it's also about, the utilities in the room, right? Like asking the question, how long is the lease on this facility going to be? Because we need to figure out if we have a solid payback period for the additional upgrades we're going to have to make, right? So asking, how long is this going to go for? If you don't hear 20, 25 years, right, you're going to have an issue with trying to find a way to fund all of the infrastructure upgrades that are required to make this thing work. So digging into the structure of the deal, asking the developer, hey, what role do you expect to play? Are you looking to just assemble powered land? Or are you going to actually go vertical and put your own couple $100 million, billion dollars into a powered shell? Dig into and ask the questions, because you don't want to find yourself too far down the road and all of a sudden you find yourself in a really, really tough position, right? And I will tell you that the communities that are asking me the tough questions up front are those that I'm most enthusiastic about working with, because that means we're trying to form a partnership, not a transaction from the beginning. There's a lot of other questions, right, about how is this thing going to be cooled, right, from a water or an air perspective. There's technologies on both sides. What, from the utility perspective, what's the ramp-up schedule look like? And then there's the other side, right? How are utilities attacking this? I mean, I've seen utilities figuring out how to vet these projects in different ways all around the country. I mean, you see where you've got the very standard kind of intake form, where you're asking a bunch of very critical questions, and if the developer or the end user can't answer certain things, then you probably have figured out what these guys are. I've seen where, like ComEd in Illinois, their way of putting up a wall and really setting that we're only dealing with the most sophisticated folks is they say, all right, $1 million for a power study, pony up or go away. Right? Very expensive cost of entry. I've got a utility up in North Dakota where I get to go next week. I get to go up to Fargo, North Dakota, and that utility was interesting in that they kind of said, all right, we're going to take control of the future of this thing. We're sick of being beaten down by inquiries every week, and we need to treat them all with some level of responsiveness, right, which is sucking down all of our resources. So they basically said, leave us alone. We are going to pay for and conduct the power study ourselves for this piece of property. Once we get through it, then we're going to issue an RFP to all of the folks that have been interested, and you get to compete to see if you're the right partner for this. So it's okay to flip the script on these guys, right? And sometimes it's more strategic to do so.
I think those are great thoughts, and particularly as communities now are struggling here, to sort through what kind of contacts are they really getting. And I mean, I think those are great questions that help dig into whether they're legit or not. How are you able to evaluate what kind of connections they really have with the big boys?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So I've got 2 data center developer clients, one of which is more than happy to, once you start talking to them, get under an NDA with your community and divulge who the hyperscalers on the back end. Or who, actually, let me retract that, who the multiple data centers are that they're going to go to and say, we have an opportunity, who wants to bid on this thing, right? Showing that they have the relationships. My other developer client has not been authorized by the hyperscalers to get into that. So that becomes a little more difficult, right? Because that's just kind of saying, just trust us to an extent. And that's hard. I would say if you find yourself talking to somebody who says, probably rightfully so, and they might be, but they're probably not pulling the wool over your eyes, and saying, I can't tell you who the back-end user is, you can start asking questions about, okay, let me understand from your perspective as the developer, how are you going to start designing this thing, right? How are you going to figure out the shape and the needs of the site? And depending on how they answer those questions, right, if they can answer those with a level of sophistication, then you know that they actually have someone in the back end who they're talking to, because all these hyperscalers have different ways of how they design their sites and their buildings, right? So if they're kind of just saying, oh, well, we'll fit it in, 1.6 million square feet, that's how much can fit on, 150, 200, 300 acres, we'll figure out the designs on. If they're a little wishy-washy about how they're going through they're envisioning the development of the site, they probably don't have somebody real on the back end. So you can dig into the design questions, I think, And that will start to hone into who it is, right? Like, when I was at River Ridge, we landed the Meta data center. They have a very unique, very distinct design. It's almost these H-shaped buildings, right? Google, I don't know what they look like, or AWS, but they all kind of look different, right? So I would say, from my perspective, dig into, does the developer have, they can't divulge who the client is, see how far you can push them on specifics, and you're going to very quickly figure out if it's a bunch of BS or if there's actually something there.
Yeah, and go with your instinct. I mean, we've all seen these pie in the sky projects that have been presented outside of this industry, just generally. And you know, if you've been doing this a long enough time, you know who has money and who doesn't. And it becomes pretty clear quickly. I think the same thing would apply in this circumstance.
Jonathan, would you talk a little bit about when you brought the utility partner into the conversation and how that conversation went?
Sure, actually, other way around. So Google was already in Columbus, and that was the site that we went and visited. The lead actually came from our electric service provider, in Ohio, and they were familiar with the site. We had partnered with them, and it was about 95% complete marketing piece for this particular site that the city owned. And so AEP was really familiar with the site, and that sort of became the discussion. And when they originally brought the project to us, they were aware of who it was. But so that certainly helped, knowing that it's AEP bringing this lead, and they're a trusted partner that wouldn't bring something to the city that wasn't real. So we didn't have a lot of doubts from the beginning, but having them bring it to us and know that it was a trusted partner bringing it was very helpful. On our end, on the utility side, you mentioned it a little bit, water and sewer are City of Fort Wayne utilities, and all the projects I've worked on in the last 10 years, this is the one that was the utilities were most important for in terms of the incentives. Like we had a few council members that really realized that. Are there any city council members in the room here? Can I speak candidly? A lot of them did not, didn't really ask any questions about how the utility part of it worked, but we had a handful of them that really got familiar with this project and asked those kind of questions at the city council table, where that agreement, the way it works in Fort Wayne, that utility agreement isn't approved by city council as part of the taxpayer agreement or anything like that. But some of the questions we got at the table that night were about how that was going to work, and wanting to make sure that, just kind of in general terms, that the project was paying its fair share, that this wouldn't be done on the backs of a regular utility rate there in the city of Fort Wayne. So that was really critical for us.
How do you think you would have handled this if your utility was not the entity that brought you the project?
I mean, everything you said was spot on. Like if someone brought a project to us right away and asked for $1 million for a study, and they weren't putting $1 in, that project wouldn't have had a lot of time in Fort Wayne, right? Like we wouldn't have a data center there if that was the approach. I learned those things during the year. I didn't know going into it, but during the land use planning, one of the concerns we had from citizens was about sounds. That this is kind of a thing online, and I think it was maybe more prevalent a few years ago, and it was, from what we found, particular to Amazon data centers built maybe in 16, 17, 18 range, I think, that there's sort of this high pitch, but not very loud, and just kind of annoying, nonstop hum that comes from these. That there were some residents where data center was built very close to sort of high-end residential, where this became an issue, and so that kind of picked up a little bit of steam in Fort Wayne, and that was one of the reasons we made the first visit. But during that whole process, we started to learn, the Amazon facility is built different than the Google facility and Meta, and to your point, the people we met with throughout could speak in great amount of detail about how they design their data centers, why they design them that way, how the cooling works, and just like any projects you guys work on, they had resources that they brought to the table when there were questions that needed addressed. like any good partner that you'd be working with, so.
So one thing to note, and the reason why I asked that question, I think a more fundamental question that you all need to be asking yourselves is, do we even want a data center? It's not the right fit for every community. It's just not. Right? It's just like an automotive OEM, it's not the right fit for every community. Right? As a slaughterhouse operation, it's not the right fit for every community. Although I heard we're raised open for business versus. Is that true, Josh? Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Good sales guy. But you have to figure out, is this something we want? Right? Is, say we've got an identified 300-acre piece of land that we know that in the comprehensive land use plan is slated for industrial, right? Do you want to give that away to something that is not going to create maybe the number of jobs that a true industrial manufacturing project can bring? The answer to that may be yes, because guess what? Our market is saturated with workforce issues, and we're kind of looking for a smaller number of jobs but higher average wages, and we're looking for the investment to really bolster our tax increment, right? So maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is there's a rail line right there, and we've spoken to the provider, and it's never easy to just build a spur, but it's actually one of the better locations to bring in a spur, and we can actually do some really good rail served industrial end user operations here that brings in a couple hundred jobs, right? So you have, the nice thing is I just presented on this at area development, and this is turning lemons into lemonade, but by all accounts, economic indicators are showing that we're kind of going into a cool down period in industrial, right? Going into 2025. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think what that means is, as economic developers who have the opportunity right now to sit down and strategize, right? Reopen your targeted industry analyses, speak with your community leaders, and you're going to have this kind of opportunity in this lull to really figure out, who do we want to be when we grow up? At this juncture, what do we want the site to be when it grows up? And I recommend that before you even get into entertaining requests from data centers or developers, you go through that process to ensure that's what we want, because it's going to be a lot easier to then put all the puzzle pieces together if that's something you want versus sounds nice, right?
I could not agree more. Not every community, like you said, is really wants a data center. Right now, you all understand it because you're in the middle of this industry as it's developing, and you can see how many people have been contacted. But let's face it, your elected officials are not, and that's no fault of their own. It's a totally different project than anything they've ever seen. So to the extent that as a leadership group, you can start that education process, not leading to one conclusion or the other, but just the education process of what a data center is, what it's going to mean to the community, where would we want it, where are we going to have opposition, how, etc. Then you'll be so much more prepared when the actual opportunity comes along. And that preparation, as you talked before, when you deal with communities, it's the ones that are really asking the right questions, that have thought through this, that can really accelerate your ability to have a project. These data center projects, they're looking at multiple sites. So there is an opportunity to distinguish yourself just based on how prepared you are, how much confidence you can convey, that this is something that we really want in our community, and we're going to be a great partner with the company. In terms of the benefits to the community, I see the biggest thing is the assessed value. Even though you give, there's abatement on the data center equipment, you still have significant real estate taxes. Often there's an abatement with those, but not necessarily for the full amount, and the numbers are so big that it can create additional assessed value. Because of the magnitude of the value of the abatement and the needs of the communities, often developers will be willing to make economic development payment or community impact payment to the municipality. And why that's so important is that a large influx of assessed value helps you with tax rate relief. It creates a bigger base on which to generate your fixed levies, resulting in a lower rate, but it doesn't generate any other dollars for the community. That's a general statement, but pretty true. So these economic development payments can give you flexible money that you can then leverage this project into other things you want to do in the community. And I know that was an important factor when we worked with Fort Wayne. From Google's perspective, it has been from the community's perspectives that I represent.
And actually, Rick, I would argue that, and none of my discerned clients are in the room, right? Like, I'm kind of, but I would argue even that you should be borderline requiring community impact payments as part of your due diligence process, right? Because the big boys that are actually going to do this, like they understand from what they do, like that's a cost venture, right? That's how we become good corporate citizens in the communities, right? So I'm a big fan of community impact payments. I think it helps to further the relationship a little bit more. Yes, that's all I wanted to throw there.
Referencing the same project, obviously, yeah, we did end up, although abating some of the real estate property taxes, having a supplemental payment included in part of our agreement with Google. Yeah, that, again, if you're able to attract one of these large companies, I think that's a reasonable expectation to work into your agreements with them, definitely. And that was, like I said, that's what kind of pushed them into that top 15 taxpayer category for the city of Fort Wayne, which was really important for us.
Jonathan, the workforce needed for a project like this is a little out of the ordinary. Did you have conversations with your client about how you're going to handle that or what the training was going to be?
Yeah, that's been an interesting one. So again, when we visited the Columbus site a couple times, they told us we have about 1,000 construction workers on site over the course of a week, 600 to 800 there on a daily basis. And I think, okay, sure, all right, we'll go see it. And you show up there, and there was a lot of gravel parking, and it happened to have been a dry period for a couple, 10 days before we went. And you just see the cloud of dust coming up that morning as people were pulling in, and you're like, I count the cars. There's 800 cars there. Yeah, very, very big site. And so in the city, that was one concern early on, was just how do we get those kind of construction numbers? And we knew that, the workforce we have in Fort Wayne, good construction workforce, but not, if they took if all 800 of those construction workers came from within the city, we probably wouldn't be building anything else for the next 10 years. So, they talked a lot about during the process how they are able to bring, some national contractors, but would rely a lot on the local subs. That was certainly a part of it, but so construction really started, we're about 12 months into it from when they started, and again, kind of talking about those ancillary benefits of some of these larger companies like a Google. They have a STAR program, which is a workforce development program that they bring into each of these communities where they're building large-scale data centers. And they launched that program in Fort Wayne. The first cohort started in October, I believe, and they graduated a group of 12, 15 residents, something like that, through this program, had their first graduation a few weeks ago. And it's paid training, about a 5-6 week training program to teach people some of the basics of the construction trades. They really do target underserved populations which was a great fit with the location. They ended up in Fort Wayne, the highest unemployment section in the city. And so they partnered with Ivy Tech in Fort Wayne to put together that program, offer it through Ivy Tech. And we're excited to see that first graduate group come through. And I believe they committed to do 6 of those cohorts over the next year. So hopefully they continue to keep doing that. And we have, I think electrical has been the biggest issue in Fort Wayne, is finding enough people with experience doing the electrical side of the construction. And so that first group really focused on that.
That's an example of what I talked about earlier in terms of the great communication that Google had with the city. So Google wants to be a great corporate citizen. They have a track record of that. So with the city communicating what they needed, then Google was able to react to that and come up with positive results, like Jonathan just described.
So, and by the way, the title of this panel was not necessarily, data centers, what the hell, right? It's about, bigger, larger projects. So I'm also going to mention, I'm going to tie this into, more traditional manufacturing that's energy intensive. I've got a client right now, and this is the complete opposite end of the spectrum from a data center client, where, and we don't see a lot of these days, but this is a 1,000 job creation manufacturing project. Final assembly of big HVAC industrial chiller units that go on top of, among other things, data centers. But 1,000 jobs, right? And they don't need the same level of power as a data center, right? They're not looking for hundreds of megawatts, but we do need 90 megawatts. And so the sites that would qualify for us to be able to be up and running by the end of 2027, early 2028, are probably going to be the same sites that these data center developers and the data centers are looking at as well. And so that goes back to my point about you need to figure out what you want, right? Because let's say hypothetically you have a 300, 200 acre site in your community that's primed well for industrial. You could find yourself in a position where you have to go, do we want the project that brings 1,000 new good manufacturing jobs, including welding and specialized, tinkering, et cetera, or do we, are we kind of strained, our workforce pipeline is strained in that regard? We don't have enough welders in the community for something like that, and it actually makes more sense for us to go for something that's a little more on the lesser side of job creation. But the jobs that are created are a little more specialized, right? Network engineers and, like you said, electrical. And so it all comes back to, I'm going to keep hammering home on this, right? Figure out what you want to be able to grow up in. From the workforce perspective, that's key as well. Talk to your workforce partners to determine, are we even set up and established to pump out, out of the 1,000 jobs on this project, which, by the way, I'm going to be issuing RFIs in Northern Indiana, so just FYI, this one will be coming through. Project Rebound is what it's called. But can we even accommodate, 300 welders, new welding positions? The answer might be no, right? Absolutely not. Ask them, can we even accommodate or figure out how to produce enough network engineers and these very specialized data center operators? The answer might be no, right? So just like you need to be talking to your utility partners, I think, great question on that. I mean, workforce is something is a litmus test for you as well.
All right, I'm just going to ask if there are any questions. The Honorable, would you care?
Earlier on when the data center industry was getting started, there were a number of site selection criteria that were risk related, such as not being in an area where blasting is occurring, things like that. Are those still roughly the same today? And conversely, if a data center lands, do often they ask for restrictions on adjoining land uses?
So the question was, just to repeat for everyone, do data centers still have the kind of risk aversion for their site, or they're still looking at limited exposure to earthquakes or dust from adjoining landowners?
Rail lines, pipelines.
Yeah, I mean, especially from a natural disaster perspective, that's something that's like a number one, slicer for my clients, right? From a rail line perspective, that's interesting. I've got a site that I'm investigating where there's actually a rail running right through the middle of the site that cuts it in half. And at first I went, no, this isn't going to work. And the client said, let's dig in and see how busy this line is, right? And we dug in and we realized, hey, it's on a good week, it's one train a week. They're kind of just moving a couple of cars, from here to there. It's not busy enough, and so it's not black and white on that front from the rail perspective. And what I thought was a big, just default no having rail even near the site, right? Ended up being, it's not that busy, it's not that big of a deal. I think all the factors are still the same though. The number one thing is, right, they want to make sure if one of these data centers ever went down, the ramifications of that, even if it went down for a couple of hours, would be unfathomable, right? I mean, it's probably actually measurable, but in my simpleton brain, it's unfathomable. So they're very, very risk averse. The second part of the question was, the neighbors.
They ask for restrictions on
Yeah.
land uses as part of the incentive package.
We typically like to make sure there's never going to be anything around us that has potential to go boom, right? Any noxious or obnoxious smells, typically is something they're not interested in being around, because especially if they're an air chill data center, right? That just becomes, it gets a little murky on that front. You have to remember this is not traditional manufacturing, and they're trying to attract, the average wage on one of my data centers is 86, what was the most recent one we did? 86 to 92,000 a year. So you also have to remember, like, the folks that are driving into this pristine campus, the data centers have to think about protecting their own investment. To your point about, are we going to find ourselves eventually where all the cornfields around us turn into a bunch of, smokestacks and just loud, nasty, industrial? Do we ever try to get the community to place restrictions on the other sites around us? No, but it's more of an understanding, right? That if we're coming, this area of the community needs to be something a little different. The main concern is to UGROP sound, right? The NIMBYism, right? If I lived adjacent to a site that was going to go industrial, I think I'd much rather have a data center than something like a smelting factory or something like that, right? But there is usually a high pitch. I've always thought it was a low pitch. Okay. Yeah. There is a concern that there's this low, like, kind of like you can't like necessarily feel in your chest, but if you have residential adjacent to a data center, you're probably, as community leaders, going to be hearing about it for a while, right? So yeah, that's my response there. You got some more hands up?
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I saw Chelsea's hand up.
Yes,
I'll go there first.
You talked about, obviously, utility intensive abatements. I haven't heard anything about TIF. Was Fort Wayne in its TIF? Did you try to TIF? And for Devin or Rick, any other? We don't have a lot of schools in Indiana. We've got abatements, we've got TIF. So you can talk a little bit about TIFs and rural enabling projects.
Okay, so the question has to do with incentive tools used by the local government, TIF, for example, and how that played into the conversation.
Yeah, the site for the data center in Fort Wayne was a city-owned site. The existing property that we owned was an existing TIF district. The property had been donated to us almost 20 years ago, and we had a little bit of development out there, but still owned, it's at about 250 acres. But again, as talks unfolded, they quickly started looking at additional land outside of city limits and outside the existing TIF to put together a total of about 800 acres. And so as they started acquiring options on those properties, we started putting together a plan to both annex some of that property as well as extend the existing TIF district. The existing district didn't really have a lot of funds, and there, a project this size, there were some pretty large water and sewer needs to make the project able to happen. But in this case, Google really funded a lot of that upfront capital, or committed to, for their expansions as needed over a couple of phases. So again, I believe it's the second phase of the district, or of the data center, was planned to be inside our TIF district, and what's under construction right now was not originally in. But we did, when we presented at City Council a year ago, indicated that our plans would be to extend the district to include this construction site, so that we would be able to kind of grow that area in the future, be able to expand utilities, look for another development site, and have more resources to put back into economic development in the future.
I'm a little hamstrung here because, the Google project's obviously public. I represent others in data center discussions and, far down the line discussions. The TIF is definitely important to the community because it's material, as we talked about with the additional real estate taxes that are available. My experience has been that the abatements that come are not 100%. Now again, it's all private negotiations at this point. So the community is looking to be able to capture those taxes that are paid into TIF, and it is part of the calculus when they look at what is the meaning to this community. I have not been in the situation where they had to take that TIF in order and spend it in a way that was necessary to provide that infrastructure.
Just to add on to that, one thing that was kind of interesting that came up in Fort Wayne, we have not really done before. There is an allowance in state code that was added a few years ago that kind of gave a little more flexibility for TIF funding to schools, basically through a grant with a limit of, I think it's 15% of the revenue could go towards something like that. And early on, when news of this project came out, it's in our East Allen Community School Corporation. They reached out with some concerns and questions. There's a number of public school districts in Fort Wayne and Allen County, and we have, like everyone else, we have our school board member that's a non-voting member that always participates. And we actually had one of those members that's currently serving as a voting member, so he moved up, was on the school board, was a great non-voting member, asked a lot of great questions, was really supportive of Mayor Henry at the time, so he's actually added and still serves on the school board as well. So, like I said, we've had a long history of really good support from our schools for economic development in Fort Wayne. We got a little bit of pushback from them on this one, and we worked with Baker Tilly actually to really dive into the numbers of the impact of the project and essentially what would happen because of the way our property taxes work in Indiana and the impact of the levy limits. We could kind of show if we did nothing and this project happened, you would get X dollars. If we TIF this and offer you that grant program, you could get more than what you would get if we did nothing. And so that was really the case we made, and took the time to lay out all those numbers and work with them, and we're at the point where they're as supportive as they're ever going to be. So there's I mean, our schools need funding. I mean, we don't hold that against them. It's a tough conversation, but we at least got to the point where we could go to them and say, look, we can make this better than it would be at this project if we didn't extend the TIF district, and so we have their support at this point.
Okay. Is there a hand over here? Okay.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Jonathan. So as the project grew to a much larger site, whether it be data center or any other site, this specific site crossed multiple jurisdictions. Could you talk through how that process, because it's rather unique to ask what you guys had to ask in the community, and how that happened, and that collaboration, how it went on?
Thanks, Chad. Chad knows because Chad's from our Lido, right, from Greater Fort Wayne, and this is, I think since, I don't know, Rick, your experience, this has happened in Fort Wayne. I feel like this is my 18th panel on data centers. Everybody wants to hear what's going on, but there's so many of them going on in the state now that just great to see the investment here. As Chad brought up, Greater Fort Wayne, honestly, like when I talked about the property acquisition, there's so many people that we had to pull in, like so many kind of all hands on deck situations when you realize this is a real project and the level of investment. Our city utilities, our planning staff, our redevelopment staff, Greater Fort Wayne. There were several times over the year where we all just had to kind of stop other things we were working on and come together and figure out what we needed to do next. And Greater Fort Wayne and the legal team that they put together did an amazing job of pulling together all those properties in the first place like that. There were times where we thought, oh, I hope they can do this with 300 acres because the 800 they're looking for just seems crazy, that we'd be able to get all of them. And again, great team that worked really hard on it and got us there. So I think Chad probably heard me tell the story at a different panel, so I'll go back to that one. So working with our Department of Planning Services, there was property, you can check your state code, I don't know how this happened. There was property that Fort Wayne Redevelopment owned at one point that was actually in the city of New Haven. So another part of the process was asking New Haven to de-annex that property, which most cities aren't really familiar with that process, rightfully so. It's not something we're asked to do very often. But again, there was a way to get their support because they're basically up against that side of the city of Fort Wayne. They were looking for some utility improvements in the area. The Google project would bring water and sewer closer to them and expand capacities in that area. So there was some discussions there, and we were able to make that work and get that moving forward. But I mean, it required, because we have planning services for the city of Fort Wayne and planning for Allen County. And again, some of the properties originally in the city of New Haven. After that was de-annexed, we were able to get both planning groups to work together and hold joint meetings to try and accelerate the schedule so that we could get this all approved in about a 6-month period. So again, lots of all hands on deck and lots of just support in our community. Our community's been focused on economic development in Fort Wayne, definitely during Mayor Henry's tenure, and it's continued on under Mayor Tucker. And when a project like this, when people realize what's at stake in Fort Wayne, we've usually done a pretty good job of putting all our resources together and going after it.
Young lady right there.
Just a question on the land side. So it sounded obviously it expanded quite a bit. Is there a minimum amount of acreage that these bigger data centers are really requiring?
I mean, there, and I'll look to,
Repeat the question was, is there a
Yeah.
minimum acreage that a larger data center is likely to be looking for?
I'll speak to my experience. I'll maybe look to the IDC to kind of know what you guys have seen as well. But these days, these hyperscalers are looking for multiple hundreds of megawatts of power, right? Which translates to multiple hundreds of acres of land. The smallest site that my guys are allowing me to investigate would be about 200 acres. And in that jurisdiction, it's about 200 acres, according to about 250 megawatts. Anything below that, right? I'm kind of their hunter. I'm out looking for unicorns and needles in the haystack, and anything below that, they typically say, no thanks. Not to enough scale for it to be compelling enough for us to make the investment in this community. So I'm going to throw out there the number 200 acres as kind of a bare minimum, but that's just from my personal experience.
That's been my experience as well, and typically larger than that.
Yeah, typically larger than that, but yeah, I've been okay with 200 every once in a while.
We've got time, I think, for one more, maybe two. I see Bob's hand, and then maybe we'll get back here.
Are you guys seeing any peripheral investment around these sites? Anybody coming in because they want to be close or increasing jobs?
Question is there a supply chain or are there peripheral additional users that are following the data center to your community?
You've got the example of like Northern Virginia and Columbus, Ohio, where as soon as one big hyperscaler put the flag down, everybody else started trying to flood into the market, right? So you do kind of have that once the market is cracked, then you probably have you had other hyperscalers? Yeah, other hyperscalers reaching out, right? From a supply chain perspective, not really. They're pretty insular. I mean, you do need some outside firms to help with certain things that make more sense from a contracting perspective. But I would generally say that a data center is going to be a standalone investment. It's not going to need a supply part or something like that. That being said, I think the number is, for every data center job, it's like a 5x multiplier, so you get really nice ripple effects in the community, but yeah, you're not seeing the supply part stand up around them. Just maybe more hyperscalers trying to get in.
All right, young lady in the black for our final question.
My question was about utility requirements, and are you running into any conversations about corporate sustainability goals with these companies and renewable energy sources, for example? And how are you addressing them?
Yeah, I mean, renewables are a huge part of it, right? I mean, even my developer clients, that, developers, what they do right there with sinks, and they are speculative to some extent unless you're doing build to suit, but they've even said, like, let's not look at locations where we can't figure out the renewable energy, the decarbonized energy solution, because the hyperscalers will not be as attractive. I don't know if how it applies to the different ones, the renewable energy certificates, if that's enough, or if it needs to be direct electrons into building. But from a higher level, yes, renewables are important. From a water perspective, the current technology, right, is primarily water chilled. It could be a closed loop system, it could be, there's multiple different iterations, but you're seeing more and more trends towards trying to get into these air chilled, which me looking at far North Dakota, I always have to open up the windows more good. But the air chilled to try to alleviate impacts on the environment from another perspective, aka draining your water resources, especially in water scarce areas of the country. So I think it's going to be by locale, right? If you're in a very water-rich location, probably makes more sense to, because if you're air cooling a data center, that requires more power, right? So more power could then put more pressure on sustainability goals, depending on where you are. So water could be the sustainable option. If you're in an area where it's water scarce, then that's a whole different conversation. But yeah, as part of it, that is a number one consideration that I have to look at as I'm going through and evaluating sites, is the potential for sustainability.
All right, I want to thank the panelists for sharing their knowledge with us today. We have hit time, and I know there's a busy agenda ahead of us. So let's give a round of applause to these folks.